Hi all, this is a video on how to use a panel saw. A panel saw is used for cutting sheet goods normally. It is an alternative to using the table saw, which can sometimes be an awkward and therefore dangerous tool to use for cutting sheets of wood. In general, you're using it to cut plywood. Plywood has alternating sheets in it, and that means that there's no definitive ripping or cross-cutting, but the panel saw can cut in both this direction and this direction, whatever you want to call them. It feeds, in this case, from the right, though it could alternatively feed from the left in a different setup. And the reason for that is that there are these little rollers that help push the wood against the back so that it isn't flopping around when it's being cut. So for that reason, if you tried to push it from the left, it wouldn't work very well. When you're bringing the wood into the wood shop through the doors, it conveniently slides right into this side. So we're going to slide our piece of wood in, and we'll pretend that I want a 4-inch piece of wood. So I'm going to measure 4 inches off the top, and I'm going to mark it in such a way so that I know exactly where I'm going to cut to get my 4 inches. So I'm going to cut to the left of the 4-inch mark on the tape, and so that I know I want to place the blade just to the right of that. That'll leave the Sharpie mark on my final piece, but we'll pretend that for this piece of wood that doesn't matter to me. So that's where we want to make the cut. When we're cutting in the vertical orientation on the panel saw, we line it up like so with our mark about in the middle, and then we take the vacuum hose off of the saw and bring it down, and we're just going to line up our mark with the blade. So we're going to actually look right through the vacuum port until we're lined straight up with the blade, so that the blade just looks like a line in our vision, and then we're going to line it up right with the place where we want to cut. So in this case, I'm going to line it up right with the right side of the Sharpie mark. So once it's there, I can let it go back up, because we never want to start a tool while it is touching the workpiece, and put the vacuum back on. Something nice here is that for the most part, gravity is holding our piece in place. So we don't really, unless it's a really light piece, gravity and these rollers are helping just keep everything in place. So all we need to worry about is pulling the saw down. I'm going to activate the saw. It shares with the blade, and turn it on. The vacuum does a decent job with thicker pieces of wood, but with thinner pieces of wood, you're going to find you're going to have to do a little more vacuuming up afterwards. When you're placing your hand into the saw handle, it's important to think about where your hand is going to be. Sometimes people will put their hand through the cord here, and then when they're halfway down, they'll find that they're trying to pull against the cord. So make sure that you don't have your hand there. In this case, the vacuum is getting pulled by a pulley hanger, so I'm not too worried about my arm holding on the vacuum, but if I was, I could make extra sure by putting my arm on the outside of that loop. So glasses are a good protective measure. Otherwise, the blade is pretty well contained, and it isn't a terribly loud tool. So I'm just going to pull the trigger, cut all the way down, release, let the blade come to a stop, and then come back up. Once you cut all the way through, the piece of wood can shift. So it, in general, is not a good idea to pull back up while the blade is still spinning, because it could cut into one or both of your pieces as you're coming back up and they've shifted. There is a spring with a cable that's pulling the saw back up the track, so you don't need to actually lift it. It pulls itself for the most part. And its default position sits right around there. And now we have our piece of wood that is 4 inches on the mark. What we're going to look at next is a cutting operation in the other direction. So if we want to do that, it's slightly different. The way we do it is we put our mark on a piece of wood, which I'll just arbitrarily put here. And we move the blade so that it's in this orientation. And the way we do that is by pulling this indexing pin. So you pull that out and then rotate 90 degrees. You can't see the blade, so sometimes it can get confusing to know which way you're cutting. Conveniently, there's an arrow right here that shows feed stock with an arrow. So it's telling you to put to feed your wood in this way. And also, if you think of this like a circular saw, then you would put your hand here on the circular saw and cut this way. So the wood is going in this direction. That's important because if you go from the other way, it's not going to do anything. So again, we're going to take the vacuum hose off and use that port to align with our blade. So I'm going to bring that down. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to lock on this knob to keep the blade in that position. So I'm holding it right in that position by locking this down. And then again, I'm going to pull the wood away so it's not in contact with the blade when we start. I will put the vacuum right back on there. And now the trick is so that we can bring our wood through, excuse me, we're going to pull the trigger and then push this retaining pin into the trigger so it'll keep it on. So once we're ready to make the cut, we'll pull the trigger, push that in, and then pull the piece of wood through. In this orientation, we're going to pull through from the bottom, and with a bigger sheet, you would push through from one side, maybe halfway, and then go through to the other side and pull the remaining wood out. Something that's important to remember is that that piece of wood, once you're cut all the way through, could fall down into the blade and cut a chunk out. So if it's important to you that that doesn't happen, what you need to remember to do is to support the wood from the top, to hold on to it, to lift, so as you pull it through, its weight isn't bringing it down into contact with the blade. So now that that's all set up, I'm just going to pull the trigger. What I did is I just pulled the trigger again. So after it was being held on by the pin, I just pulled the trigger and that turned it off. So I was not supporting the top piece when I pulled it through, and that resulted in just a small nick on the edge. So that's the result of not supporting the piece when it comes through and then it lands on the blade. So when you're done, you just want to remember to loosen this this clamp back up and turn it back into the normal operating position. And as I mentioned before, you're going to want to do a little vacuum because this tool does not do a great job of collecting all of the dust that it produces. And that is all there is to using the panel saw.